begin by talking a little bit about who we are, and I want to tell you a little bit about what I do, just so it gives you a bit of context for the way that I'm approaching our project. I am an artist, a studio artist, and so my own work really is print-based, and I look at from the standpoint of both my sort of academic-related research. I look at print culture, and I look at post-colonialism and aesthetic histories. And that influences the kinds of projects I do, which tend to be based in print-generated installations or sculptures, and so that sometimes relates to things like wallpaper or printed vernacular materials like money, etc. So that's essentially how I kind of constitute my work in the world normally, but I also do some curating. And I've done probably 4 or 5 curatorial projects and written about the work. And so one of the things I would say in terms of my practice or my methodology is that I think I come to discursive frameworks through material. And so even as a curator, I really am always looking around and trying to make connections. And so the opportunity to work in this situation really probably goes along with what Walter described about the Neo-Baroque, and that is that it's exogenous. And I think for me, the coming to the Neo-Baroque is really a way of beginning to frame some of the work that I have done and some of the work that I would like to be doing. In the paper today, I'm using the word tracing the Neo-Baroque impulses in recent Canadian art, but originally I even had the word finding, because in fact I wouldn't want to claim that the artists that I'm looking at are in any way self-consciously referring to the Baroque or even self-consciously engaged in the Neo-Baroque. So this is a kind of archaeology that is really kind of taking up certain works and applying some of the concepts that we've been talking about here to that work. The exhibition that I'm using as the sort of framework or lens with which to actually consider the work that I did is the exhibition from 2000 from the San Diego Art Museum called Ultra Baroque that traveled quite widely, and I saw at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And some people were asking about that exhibition and even the notion of Ultra Baroque, and I have to say I hadn't intended to spend a lot of time on that exhibition per se. It's really some of the sort of concepts and the theory around some of the work that I was looking at in relation to the works that I'm going to be talking about. But I will say a bit about the exhibition specifically, and I would recommend it was a pretty landmark kind of project that I think brought even the problems of how to think about the Latin American Neo-Baroque put that on the table and in a wider cultural context. The other thing I should say, and I will get going with my paper, but my own experience as an artist and with some of the projects I've done has been very much involved, especially more recently, with trying to sort of intersect with the work of First Nations artists in Canada. And I've had a lot of experience living in northern Canada, working with Inuit people, also working with First Nations Indian people in cities in Canada. And so one of my questions at a moment of obviously post-colonial troubling, and also in context of some of the environmental situation we're looking at, one of my questions is how are artists in Canada, how are contemporary artists dealing with this moment, and are in fact artists of First Nations ancestry dealing differently, without being essentialist, are they dealing differently necessarily with some of the problems than other artists, other contemporary, other, what we could say, post-colonizer artists in Canada? And so that's one of the biggest questions that I have that is actually a bigger, more ongoing problem that I certainly am not expecting to solve today. Okay, so I will get going, having said that. So, the premise of my presentation is to utilize the landmark exhibition Ultra Baroque, Aspects of Post-Latin American Art, and its surrounding research as the frame through which to look at the exhibition Hinterlands, which presented the work of Canadians Fastworms, and Fastworms are actually a duo of artists. Sky Glavish, he's one artist, Diana Thornycroft, and Colette Urban. Their works were in an exhibition I recently curated in London, Ontario, Canada, and that show is going to travel next year to Harbourfront Centre in Toronto. And there was a brochure which you can have with a small essay that I wrote. In this context of the Neo-Baroque, I also wanted to consider works by First Nations Canadian contemporary artists Kent Monkman and Rebecca Belmore. I'm doing this work in anticipation of a curatorial project that has the working title, and this is the project that I would hope to obviously link to our work. And the working title is Untrue North, the Neo-Baroque impulse in contemporary Canadian art. And I should say that the artists that I'm looking at here in the Hinterlands exhibition are not necessarily artists that I would be including in that future exhibition. I will say that the work of Kent Monkman and Rebecca Belmore, on the other hand, I'm particularly interested in for that purpose. So to begin, I want to offer my 3 background-oriented research questions and some provisional thoughts in response to them. The first is, what was the foundational premise for the curators of the Ultra-Baroque exhibition? Well, curator Elizabeth Armstrong, in her essay in the catalogue of the exhibition published in 2000, noted that, quote, the Baroque has been a Eurocentric cliche in reference to Latin American art and culture, but that the exhibition looks at the validity of the Baroque as a means of examining our globalizing impulses, particularly in the area of visual culture. Armstrong goes on to further note that the curators suggest that the Baroque is a model by which to understand and analyze the processes of transculturation and hybridity, close quote. The curators therefore propose the Baroque as an attitude rather than a style that is interdisciplinary in nature and not restricted to the fields to which it has been traditionally confined. So that's in response to the question of the curator's intent. My second question is such a conception, the Neo-Baroque or even the Ultra-Baroque, relevant to a Canadian visual art context? A big question to which I'm just going to give a small answer for now. I want to argue that the conception can and should be mobilized in a context of some recent Canadian art and cultural production. Indeed, in his essay in the Ultra-Baroque catalogue entitled Brazil, the Paradoxes of an Alternate Baroque, Paula Herkenhoff reminds us that, quote, the Baroque was profoundly marked by the world that it sought to justify, a fabric of different histories in which different time frames are interwoven with no single sense. The past can thus be revisited from many different viewpoints, close quote. And Herkenhoff also adds that because it is an inherited conception of the world, the Baroque often works as an empathic escape from the malaise of the present. And so this, I think, is a conception that describes a complex of histories, and a kind of complex of histories and a situation where culture is ostensibly a messy inheritance, which seems to me to invoke Canada in the 21st century in a fairly profound way.